So we are moving into fantasy literature, and as we all know, we would have come across this fantasy literature. Okay, and whenever we think of this fantasy, immediately our childhood actually comes in front, because whenever we are in very childhood days, this fantasy is the one which made us sleep. We were introduced to the bedtime stories, and even our parents have introduced characters like Santa Claus and tooth fairies, and we have read so many stories with monsters, wizards, dragons, etc. So when we hear this word fantasy, it takes us to our childhood. So that is what it is, and let us see what is this fantasy literature is all about. And this fantasy literature, it deals with werewolves, vampires, and all sorts of supernatural beings. So where the we would have seen in some movies where if body part will be cut, and normally it will be active, and some will get invisible, and we have seen so many dragons, elves, and wizards. All these actually belongs to the fantasy literature. So what sort of supernatural things are there? It all comes under fantasy literature, and it involves whose existence are known. So there will be so many shape-shifting persons, shape-shifting persons or flying horses, and so many, and it all revolves around the magical objects. So we have seen so many things, and we have been introduced to Harry Potter. I hope everybody knows about Harry Potter, where a hat comes and it is actually a magical hat. And there are so many movies where a ring comes and it has some magical properties, and it actually comes to help human beings, and a sort of goodness happens. And there are so many castles where magic happens. So all these things are actually fantasy literatures. So this fantasy literature, it revolves around the supernatural things and the magical things that happens. And you can also see some sorts of warriors, and these warriors, they will always fight against evil lords, and they will fight against evil lords, and they will bring peace and prosperity to the lands. So the only work of the warriors is to save their place, so to kill the evil and to save their plates. And this fantasy literature, it needs two persons. The one is it needs a hero, and the second one is it needs an antagonist. And always there is a conflict between the hero and the antagonist, that is the evil and the good. And at last, it is always the good that actually comes true. And from these things, we can actually learn that it is always the good thing that prevails in the earth, and the evil will always defeat. That is the main social consciousness which actually comes out of this fantasy literature. And fantasy, it always treats these impossibilities without hesitation. It makes us to imagine. It actually makes the readers to develop our imagination, and it believes such things. And okay, so this fantasy, it implies the universal truth through supernatural and magic. So many universal truth or many simple things will be instructed to us through these supernatural and the magics. And these stories will have magics with them, and these magics, we have learned these supernatural magics even in the oral forms. So whenever this literature has come, when the literature has come, this fantasy is there in the literature starting initial times itself. It existed in the oral form. So we have heard so many fantasy stories from our grandmas, or from our parents, or from our forefathers. So those fantasy stories existed in the oral form, and it still exists there. And I have already told you, it is the fantasy literature, it has the supernatural as their element. And the supernatural element, it can be a whole setting, one thing, it can be a whole sitting, or else it can be an only one object. And these characters will make us believe that it is actually a true one, and it is there still hiding in some part of the world. That is what these authors or these characters made us to believe it. And these sorts of fantasy came from the fairy tales in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, it is the fairy tales who it first introduced fantasy in them. And the early fiction, right? We know when we as we are from literature zone, we know about Beowulf, Iliad, and Odyssey. And these historic and classical pieces has fantasy in it. So it is not that it is a current trend; it is actually a classical trend where the fantasy is there. So we cannot argue that fantasy is actually a current trend, because it has been stated that it is there in the classical elements. So it is, we have a proof that the fantasy is still has been existed in the olden age. And these Grimm brothers, they are the one who first published the fairy tales in Germany, and they translated it into England. And the fantasy, right? So it has so many classical histories other than it. It is not that they have selected authors for this fantasy writings. It is our own legendary writers like William Shakespeare or Dante or Milton. They've also written fantasy works. And we also know, we have learned from Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, that we have all sorts of fairies. So they are actually fantasy supernatural creatures. So it is not that there are only particular authors who are writing it. Even our own famous writers are using them in their novels to just attract the readers. So we have examples. Peter Pan. Peter Pan is actually the one who is very popular figure and is known about children and all. So that is one of the examples. And the next one is Chronicles of Narnia. Everybody knows about Chronicles of Narnia because it has come as a film, and even small kids would have read the book. So all these things are the famous qualities of the fantasy. And this fantasy, it brings us a sense of wonder. We would be wondering about their description, about the plays, about the characters, all those things. And in spite of this wondering, it makes us very familiar. It doesn't make us unrealistic. It actually makes us very realistic, and it makes us look the characters as though it is our own friends or some others who is having all those pasts. And it is actually the early German romantics. They were the first to explore this kind of fairy tales as a written genre. And the first written fairy tale is The King of Golden Flower. It is written by John Ruskin, and where the King of the Golden River, he helps the persons to get the gold. Important developments were made in the literary figures. There are two characters, George MacDonald and William Morris. They had their great time in developing all these literary fairy tales. And again, we are seeing about C.S. Lewis. So even before this, even before C.S. Lewis, maybe some would have been introduced to fantasy. Maybe some would have learned fantasy, but it is only after C.S. Lewis we come to know about fantasy a lot. We come to know about fantasy from his Chronicles of Narnia, and also we learned about the Alice in Wonderland and everything. So all these because of him. And J.R.R. Tolkien's we everyone would have seen Lord of the Rings. So these two writers have played a very crucial part in developing this fantasy literature. So they are the person who has reshaped this fantasy to fit. And fantasy, we always know that fantasy is the one who is influenced by myth and folklore. So everything along brings up together is fantasy. So in fantasy, you have all the tales of big wizards or dragons. Okay, and those things were brought up in the 20th century by J.R.R. Tolkien. And we would have seen it in The Lord of Rings and Hobbit. Nobody can actually forget this Hobbit. It is one of the most precious texts. And other thing is, after this Lord of the Rings, a genre in fantasy actually came. So that is heroic quest. The quest for the heroic quest will be there, and ultimately everything we saw, there will be a conflict between the good and the evil. And from Tolkien to the modern authors, as we saw in Game of Thrones, or in any other inheritance of cycle books, we see all these things. And in the Stormlight Archive also, the heroic quest will be there, and that follows in all the series of books. So this is because of Tolkien. So they actually followed Tolkien, and he became as a forefathers for them in repeating this heroic quest. And um, and after Hunger Games and the Twilight series came, the fame of this fantasy genre, it actually progressed. Before, maybe there would be readers for fantasy, but the ratings in the reading of fantasy actually increased only in the 21st century because of the books called Hunger Games, Harry Potter, and Twilight series. So all these novels, they brought fame to fantasy, and the fantasy actually got a greater attention to the people, and everyone started having interest in fantasy. And this fantasy novels, it is set in either in primary world and secondary world. You have two sorts of world. You have two sorts of world in fantasy writing. So one is the primary world, or second one is the secondary world. So primary world is actually the real world where we are living, and the secondary world is actually the world where actually the supernatural beings belong to, where we can see the witches, where we can see the dragons, and all sorts of supernatural beings. And there are several novels where the mythical characters or the supernatural characters will be there in the primary world where we people exist. So there is an example for this. It is the Percy Jackson and Olympics and its sequel. And in Harry Potter also, we come to know about this platform 391, because only through the platform they can able to enter into another world, which is actually the secondary world. So that is actually the secondary world where you will find all the supernatural things. In otherwise, the supernatural beings will also enters into the primary world. So these are the examples for it. And the primary character of this fantasy is always a hero, and this hero will always be in a task of bringing victory to his world, or bringing balance, or he has to save his world. That is the only task of the hero or protagonist. So this hero, as we know, because it is actually a fantasy and supernatural literature, this fantasy, the hero will have all supernatural special qualities. So he has some special ability. Maybe he would be a shapeshifter, or he has some power. So with this, he used to oppose the enemy. So the initial, when the novel actually begins, the hero will be actually just like a normal, ordinary being, just like you and me. How you and me actually lived in this world for years and years. This hero will also live in this world for years and years, just like an ordinary human being. But what happens is, when the story actually proceeds, this hero will be dragged into the supernatural world. Maybe the anti-hero or maybe the villain, they grab the hero into the extraordinary supernatural world, where they will be given task to actually save their supernatural world or the primary world. So that is what happens in the fantasy novels. And the antagonist will be in the secondary world, and he actually comes to the primary world to drag the hero. And they can able to travel between the two worlds. They can go to the primary world, that is where we live in, and the supernatural worlds also. And you have some of the important characters who actually helps the hero there. So you will have a mentor and the magical components. So mentor, there will be a person who is also a supernatural being, and he guides the hero or the heroine in solving all the problems. And you also have magical companions. It's almost like a hat or a ring or a sword or something else, which actually helps the hero in actually protecting him. And these characters, right, so it's these characters come to introduce the hero and heroine to their mission. So the main purpose of the mentor is he will guide the hero and heroine to the mission, and they will explain the powers of the hero and heroine, and they will be introducing them to the supernatural world. There are so many subgenres of fantasy. So let me explain some of the subgenres. So the one is contemporary, and the next second is high fantasy. One is low fantasy, and heroic fantasy, and urban fantasy. Let me explain you a little one. So contemporary fantasy, we all know we live in the real contemporary world. So the themes which revolves in this contemporary real world comes under this. We know so many examples where Harry Potter is one of the famous examples, because they actually live in the era where we live, and they are almost just like our friends, or we ourselves will be imagining ourselves in their positions. So that is what is a contemporary thing. And high fantasy is you have an imaginary world, where all the supernatural will be there, and the things happen. So it is not that a real place. So the imaginary world will be actually created by the author, where all these supernatural things happen. So we know the Lord of Rings. The Lord of Rings actually the imaginary place will be built, and all the incidents will be happened there. So that is what comes. And here you have typical features will be coming. You have dragons, you have magic, you have so many elves, fairies, so many things, so sorts of fantasy things will be coming in this high fantasy. And low fantasy is where real things will not happen. So it is either happens in the real world, and but it will be a fictitious thing. So that is actually called low fantasy. And you have so many examples for this. So this Cassandra class, the Mortal Instruments, they actually live in the New York City, Manhattan. They live in New York City, and they will be just like a normal human beings, and they'll be going to college. But one day, one fine day, the heroine, she actually couldn't find her mother. So when she goes in search of her mother, she is dragged into the supernatural world, where she comes to know about many truths about her own identity, and she actually comes upon all the trials, and she comes victory. Heroic fantasy. One second. So in heroic fantasy, this hero, he is very reluctant to enter the supernatural world. So he will be just like a normal human being, and when some supernatural power comes into call, he will be very reluctant, and he will be rejecting it. He will reject entering into the supernatural world. He will be very reluctant. But one incident, it actually made him to enter. He has no other go but to enter into the supernatural world, and then he enters, and the process, the trials he have there, and the victory he have there, it all explains in the heroic fantasy. And as I told, the Mortal Instrument, Infernal Devices, Killer Chronicles, all this belongs. Whereas in all these novels, the hero or the heroine will be living in the normal world, just like us. They doesn't have any supernatural powers. But all of a sudden, they will be dragged into the supernatural world, and they will be reluctant to actually enter the supernatural world. They doesn't want to go there, but they have no other go but to save a person, so that they are entering into the supernatural world, where they have to where they will find so many obstacles, and they will actually solve all those problems or obstacles. So those are the examples. And urban fantasy is none other than the settings will be in urban settings. So this happens in the real world, and all sorts of mythical creatures, everything will be there in urban fantasy. You can find from vampires, you can find fairies, you can find werewolves, all these things. It is actually a fusion of the magic and mundane. So the normal people also will be there, and the supernatural will also be there. So there is a combination for everything. So that happens here. And the protagonist is often a fearless heroine or a daring hero. So they don't have any fear or anything. Say they will go just like that relentlessly into the supernatural world, and they will solve all the problems. So what concept is used here is the only concept used here is good versus evil. So in we could think about all the fantasy things, fantasy stories we have heard. So whenever we think about it, so the only thing we actually found it at the last is the concept is always good and evil. So it is versus good versus evil, whereas the good and evil will have a fight, and it is always the good which actually wins at the end. So through this fantasy writings, we are actually coming up with the moral things. So the authors are making the readers or the kids to believe that it is only the good that actually prevails in the end, and it is not the evil. So you have so many examples for it. And in your urban fantasy, you can find an institution or a school, and the entire concept is actually revolves around that place. Whereas in Harry Potter, you can see it is actually happens in a school. The school actually plays a very important place. And in Mortal Instruments, you can find an institution. It plays actually an important place. So you have some institution will have so many important things. And this urban fantasy novels are always centers upon heroines. We would have heard about Hungry Games, and other things where Katniss and all these heroines, they actually come bold, and they actually solve all those obstacles. And after this success of Harry Potter and other novels, this heroine based stories come into existence. Where in Harry Potter, it is Harry, but it is also Hermione who actually takes a important place, because it is without Hermione, we couldn't imagine Harry Potter. So it is also in Hunger Games. The protagonist is actually Katniss. She is actually a young adult, and she is completely independent, and she actually decides everything and is able to face the competitions, and she wins over it. So this fantasy, as all young heroines have already stepped up. So in fantasy, we can also able to see the heroine concepts, and these heroine concepts are very strong. It is not like they are weak. Maybe in our other literatures, we can see weak girls, but rather in fantasy literature, it is always a strong character. Women are always shown as very strong heroines, and it actually gathered attentions. The readers will gather attentions because of this feminism and the strong characters. So, what are we going to tell to the youngsters or to the society from this fantasy literature? Because many people would be asking us, why is it fantasy? Why is it always fantasy? And what is this fantasy is going to tell people? Because it is all about werewolves, vampires, and what are these creatures are for. But we can able to learn a lot of morals from this fantasy literature. The very first moral we learned is it is always the good that prevails in the earth, and it is not the evil. And when these characters actually are young, they are very daring, they are very courage, and they are very independent, and they are very determination. So this actually tells our kids or the youngsters to be very courageous. And these characters, protagonists, will be given so many obstacles, will face so many obstacles, but they will never give up, and they will still proceed with it. So that is what we learn from these characters. So whenever problems arouse, we shouldn't be fed up, and it is we, like the characters, we should actually fight against them, and we have to empower ourselves. So these characters and the fantasy characters actually illuminating the mind of the readers, and it is empower us with the better inhabitants, and it actually will give this, it will give imagine themselves, right? When we actually read a novel, we actually imagine ourselves as the protagonist. So when the readers imagine themselves as the protagonist, they know how to handle the situations and overcome obstacles. And so we always envision a world where we have all the courageous peoples, and we have all dangers. Rather than all these dangers, we can overcome all the situations, and we can learn how to fight against the obstacles. So these vampires and werewolves or any sort of supernatural can be taken as a problem what we are facing, and we can able to tackle it by how these protagonists tackle the problems, and we can overcome our own obstacles. So this is what I overcome in next, where I saw. So these are actually the characters of fantasy literatures, where we can learn from one. So we can learn from a girl to never give up, and we have learned from a boy to follow the fate. So each protagonist actually gives us a gives us a solution, or gives us a encouragement or positive vibes to live. So this is what we learned from fantasy literature, and it is not a current trend. It is actually a classical world which it is there from the oral literature, and it has actually grabbed its attention after the 20th century. Thank you so much.